Perfect. Hello, everyone. How's it going? I'm Jonathan Rosen. I'm here with some wonderful colleagues. Really, just briefly, going to talk about just a few points for kind of our book launch. Really honored to have a great group of scholars here from around the globe. First of all, thank you so much to the University of New Mexico Press. So we're joined by Susan Brewer-Osorio from Arizona. Ivelaw Griffith is joining us from the Caribbean, from Trinidad right now. Alberto Aziani from Italy, and Sebastián Cutrona, the co-editor from the UK. So I'll turn it over to Sebastián in just a second, but I just want to kind of give you the background to why we did this book. Many of us teach on these issues, drug trafficking, organized crime. There's some, for many years, right? There's some amazing works, people like Francisco Toomey, Desmond Arias, right? Paul Gutenberg, but so much of the literature focuses on Latin America and the Andean region. And teaching and researching this, we were kind of looking for a book that had this global scope, right? So we have, country case studies in Africa, in Asia, right? Obviously, Latin America, Caribbean, the United States, Oceania. So we kind of have this global approach to try to contribute in a way that hopefully is accessible to students. We had, a great group of scholars writing in a manner that was hopefully accessible not only to academics, but also to students. So that was kind of our logic of putting together this very diverse group of scholars from different disciplines and from around the globe. So Sebastián is going to give some brief remarks really quickly about the kind of the introduction and some trends. Then we'll turn it over to our main presenters, and I'll provide some concluding remarks. But we really appreciate everyone being here. We will have some time for questions and answers. This is being streamed live. So let me, without further ado, turn it over to Sebastián. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to all the contributors for joining us today, and thanks to the University of New Mexico Press. I think that we cannot highlight more and emphasize how good our experience was with the University of New Mexico Press. So we are very thankful for everything that has happened for the last couple of years. I just wanted to briefly discuss three major considerations regarding the book. One statement about the big picture of cocaine, then trying to quickly review what is the kind of analytical approach that we adopted in the volume, and then some big takeaways of the volume. Regarding the big picture, something that probably Susan will explore later, the cocaine supply is at record levels. So that has been largely driven by increased coca cultivation and a more efficient, manufacturing processes as well. And despite the fact that we do have, a drop in leaf prices. Regarding the analytical framework of the book, something that Jonathan already mentioned, the purpose was to provide a more comprehensive analysis of the cocaine trade. And to do so, in our book, we try to see the cocaine trade through the lenses of the global supply chain framework. The purpose was actually to reveal the value. That value is not just created equally, but is accumulated asymmetrically as the commodity chains move from specialized network from production to consumption. And some of the biggest, takeaways of the volume in general are, the first one is that we notice that, we learn in the book, especially through the analysis of most of the contributors, that the lines that have historically divided each of the stages of the supply chain are increasingly blurred. It's very difficult today to label countries as producer countries, transshipment nations, or consumer markets. Those lines that were somehow clear in the 80s and 90s have gradually started to disappear. Another major consideration regarding the criminal organizations is that they have already fragmented. Most of the organizations have moved from large cartels to smaller organizations, with specialized group also integrating third actors within the supply chains. We no longer have those large hierarchical organizations dominating more than one stage of the cocaine supply chain, as probably happened during the 80s and 90s, but multiple criminal actors operating and cooperating to bring cocaine from the Andean region to many of the consumer markets around the world. Another major idea that we propose in the book is that that underworld remains largely territorial. Despite the media and some pundits like to portray the criminal, landscape as a transnational, landscape where we have transnational criminal organizations, most of the contributors shows that we are witnessing powerful criminal organizations, but organizations that rely on affiliated groups or subcontracted brokers, service providers, and independent actors to perform logistical activities outside of their territories, meaning that not the organizations themselves are carrying out every of the activities within the supply chain. And of course, there are some exceptions. In the book, we have cases like the First Command of the Capital, moving beyond just one single activity within the supply chain. But largely speaking, we are talking about territorial organizations. And finally, something that probably Jonathan will mention at the end, the supply chain is highly adaptive to law enforcement pressure, which helps to explain, I think, and to understand why cocaine is no longer an American disease, as David Musto, said in that famous book published in the 70s. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to hand it over to Ivelaw Griffith, who is going to talk about the situation in the Caribbean. And thank you. And Ivelaw, the floor is yours.
You're muted. You're
You're
muted.
muted.
You're muted. You have to unmute.
While Sebastian loads my slides, I want to offer two general comments. The first of which is to thank Sebastian and Jonathan and the press for hosting this opportunity to have a conversation about the book. Just as important, and perhaps even more important, to thank Sebastian and Jonathan for leading this project. And it's not just because I have a chapter in it, but it's an outstanding product. And when I was approached a couple of years ago, I never anticipated having the kind of scholarly output which it has turned out to be. So I want to thank the co-editors for shepherding a phenomenal scholarly product. If you can load the slides when you get a chance, Sebastian, that would be good. But I might also add, while we wait the slides to come up, this book launch comes at a very timely moment. A timely moment when the focus on narcotics has made some adaptations, largely because of the pursuit of a policy innovation by the United States. And so the conversation around not just the Americas, but other parts of the world.
Can you see this? Sorry, can you see the slides?
I can see the slides, but I don't know if you probably need to load them.
Oh, wait a minute. Wait a second. Just 1 second. Just give me 1 second. I'll do it again. 1 second. Just 1 second. Can you see it now?
I can see it now. You can just put in slideshow mode.
There you go.
Yes, yeah. I was saying that this launch comes at a very timely moment, given the narrative and the conversation around a saga related to the Americas, a saga involving cocaine and fentanyl and other illicit practices. So my chapter, next slide, please, Sebastian. My chapter focuses on the way in which the Caribbean fits into the global matrix. And what I plan to do is to use as a conversation organizing structure something said by a gentleman who I've embraced for a number of decades now, a philosopher, Nobel laureate called Bertrand Russell. But Russell advised that sometimes you should hang some question marks on things you take for granted. And although the two question marks that I'll be dealing with, hopefully getting to the third question mark, do not cover the extent of my chapter, I think it's useful to have at least these two, maybe three question marks, enable viewers and readers to have a sense of the conversation that chapter 6, I think, is all about. So my first question mark is what's the role of the Caribbean in the global cocaine supply chain? How might we understand where the Caribbean fits in that respect? But I think it's also important to go beyond that question to a second question and have a sense of what are some of the challenges that Caribbean countries encounter in dealing with this phenomenon, in dealing with the supply chain realities and the spin-off of some of them. And if we have time, I'd like to be able to at least plant the seed of a response to the third question. What is some of the evidence of the success of Caribbean countries in battling with narco trafficking? Next slide, please. I had the pleasure a couple of decades ago of being invited to have the lead chapter in an edition of International Journal. And in that lead chapter, I proposed a notion relating to what I consider two of the key aspects of understanding the role of Caribbean and other countries in the global supply chain. And I proposed in this chapter, a notion called geonarcotics that helps to understand the supply chain role of the Caribbean. And when we go to the next slide, we'll see that, as I said in the volume at page 156, you really have to take a holistic approach to understand what geonarcotics is all about. It's about packaging a matrix in which narcotics and geography and power and politics, they're all connected. It's understanding that the fight against drugs is not amenable to just a military approach. It's important to understand that there are both conflict and cooperative elements involved in this matrix. And part of the reality of what the geonarcotics factor recommends is that we pay attention to some of the challenges that are derivative from the reality of narcotics trafficking, the violent crime, the corruption, the arms trafficking, and so on. When we get to the next slide, I captured the framework in a way that allows one to have a pictorial view of the connectivity. You know, when people talk of cocaine trafficking, they forget that an element of this framework is the money laundering. They forget that an element, the reason why that there is trafficking and the reason why there's production of what's trafficked is because there is consumption. So it's not only a supply side issue, it's a demand side. And unless you take a holistic approach and see what are the dimensions of the threats, what are the countermeasures, who are the actors, you may not have an appropriate holistic appreciation of the geonarcotics aspect of the framework, an element, the supply chain explanation. So let's go to the next slide quickly. And if you ask the question, well, going beyond the geonarcotics, if you can zero in on the geopolitics, here is where we're talking about the connectivity between geography and economics and demography and power and politics. And the harsh reality of the geopolitical elements of the supply chain involved in the Caribbean have to do with proximity between the Caribbean and supply side countries. You may or may not know that it's just 7 miles. I'm sitting in a city, Port of Spain, which is just a stone's throw away from Venezuela, and the connectivity between Venezuela and Colombia. You go a little further, you'll see the connectivity between Venezuela and Brazil. They share borders. You go further, you'll find that on the maritime side, it's just 30 kilometers between Aruba and Venezuela, 66 kilometers between Venezuela and Curacao. And so there are geographic connectivities which have got to be appreciated for you to really understand the extent to which geopolitics, geography, power, demography are all elements. But when we go to the next slide, we'll see that there are some relationships between geography and power and politics, some of which have historic antecedents to them that helps to explain the contemporary connectivity and the supply movement. this slide tells you that, look, there was a colonial past to the Caribbean and South American countries. But when we go to the next slide, we'll see that there are some contemporary political geographic connectivities that also help to explain the movement from production side in South America to destination side either in North America or Europe. Like, for example, there are British territories still in the Caribbean. There are Dutch territories still in the Caribbean. There are French départements d'outre-mer in the Caribbean. And when we go to the next slide, we'll get an appreciation of the fact that part of the reason why the movement through the Caribbean to Europe, which has had an upsurge in the last 2-3 years, has to do with not only adaptations of methods of trafficking, but next slide will recommend to us that the connectivities between the British, French, Dutch parts of the European continent and the Caribbean, those connectivities have to do with the business movement, the commercial traffic movement, the movement of legal substances, and therefore the opportunity provided to piggyback those legal connections to the illegal ones. Now, we all know that sometimes the movement is not direct. The movement is very circuitous. And I tell the story in my chapter of I myself being a victim profile, leaving a meeting in Quito, Ecuador. And because I was on my first flight back to Miami, I fit the profile of a guy traveling very lightly, taking the first trip back to North America, pulled over, strip search, and I could understand I fit the profile of a guy who was being now contracted to move the product from South America into North America, and sometimes from South America to Africa and to Europe, back to North America. So the economic and social linkages, the business connections between the territories of French, Dutch, British territories in the European continent help to explain some of that geography, politics, commercial connectivity you find explaining the link between supply chain realities in the Caribbean. Let's move quickly to the next slide. But I think the next slide allows us to ask the question, well, what are some of the challenges in managing that some Caribbean countries, all Caribbean countries face? And time does not permit me to say much more than to say that the challenges are multidimensional. The challenges have to do with capabilities, not enough personnel, not enough money, not enough technology and equipment. And when you complicate those capability limitations with the criminality, which is a spin-off, given what the narcotics framework explains, you can appreciate, next slide please, that the criminality is not only in 1 or 2 countries that you may hear about. The criminality is across the Caribbean. And the apex of the criminality is the homicides. Latin American, Caribbean countries have the dubious distinction of being the leading across the global commons for homicides. And it is no longer true that it is mostly the big islands like Jamaica or the Bahamas. It is across the Caribbean. And this next slide will show that it is also in some of the very small Caribbean territories. When you take a look at what's happening in the Eastern Caribbean, the link between the drugs, the gang operation, and the homicides is an uncomfortable set of links, realities of part of the challenges. Next slide, please. This phenomenon that we're dealing with. But I'll just take a half a minute to say that all is not lost. And I tell the story in the chapter that I focus on of a major success of a collaborative counter-narcotics operation in 2022, where Interpol teamed up with a number of Caribbean countries through an organization called CARICOM Impacts that does counter-crime, counter-narcotics, fairly useful success. And the chapter provides a portrait of how you can explain that success from that operation. So let me end by suggesting that it is not only useful to think of the supply chain as connectivity between source country and destination country. My recommendation is that we need to take a holistic approach. And although you may not be focusing on the money laundering aspect, it's important to know that that is an integer in that matrix, that supply side matrix. And hopefully, when you will have had a chance to read my chapter, you'll get a better sense of the dynamics involved in the supply side supply chain connection involving the Caribbean. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sebastián.
Thank you, Ivelaw. Now we will hand it over to Susan. Susan, I think that I stopped sharing my screen, so you have now full control of it. Yeah.
Let me see. Okay, everyone can see that?
Yes.
We're good? Okay, excellent. Well, first I want to start by thanking Sebastián and Jonathan for the opportunity to be part of this project. It was such an excellent experience, and I'm like I'm sure all the other authors, very proud of the outcome and very grateful to both of you, and also to the University of New Mexico Press for supporting this efforts. I think that this book fills a really important gap in the literature, in particular for people and students and instructors in particular who really needed a resource for making a very sort of complicated title or topic more accessible to more people. And so I appreciate that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my chapter on the Andean Cocaine Trade. As was mentioned, and I think this is right, this is a part of the world that many people have researched, and there are lots of publications, and they go in depth on cocaine production in this area. But I also think that a limitation of those previous publications is that they tend to be very deep country studies. And what I'm trying to do with this chapter is give a broad overview of the region at the same time that I try to do justice to the very important variations between the different participating countries and social groups. And so with that in mind, the chapter is really packed, but I think in a way that works, I hope. And it does try to begin with the history of coca leaf and cocaine production. And I think this is important because there is a tendency, both in research and in policy, to conflate the coca leaf and cocaine as the same thing. And this makes sense to us because the United Nations lists both as dangerous drugs, but in fact, they're very different substances, and there's quite a chemical process that coca has to undergo to become cocaine proper. And so I start there, and then I talk more about the supply chain. Of course, this region is often seen as the starting point of the supply chain, but I think it's right to actually argue that the starting point of any supply chain, including this one, is the demand. So the reality is the supply chain for cocaine really starts in the global north with the historically important countries that have provided the majority of that demand. But yes, the production does start here and has. And then to think about impacts on these societies, social, political, and also then to turn to thinking about what these things look like in the 21st century. I think I want to just start by saying that a real big takeaway of this chapter is that this region has been the focus of decades of very punitive law enforcement efforts led by the US and the United Nations to combat the drug trade in ways that have beefed up security forces and resulted in human rights violations for these societies. But with respect to the goals of those policies, they've been very unsuccessful. And this is evident in the data that tells us that between 2022 and 2023, I believe, cocaine production increased by more than 30% and is at an all-time high. And so that means that the chapter concludes, and I think the other chapters also lead to similar conclusions, that we need to be more thoughtful in deciding how to proceed from a policy perspective with respect to the cocaine trade. So there's a lot in this chapter, and believe it or not, this slide is indeed just a summary. But the history and the trends in the Andes, I think, are really critical to understanding the global cocaine trade. To begin, right, so it is the case that coca leaf, very robust, could grow in many different environments, but it has historically been cultivated in the Andes. It is really important to Andean culture, and in particular to many indigenous communities. And so even before the Inca Empire, going back thousands of years, folks in the Andes have cultivated and consumed coca, but the raw leaf is really very benign herbal stimulant. It doesn't really have any, at least from a scientific perspective, no negative impacts on human health, and it could potentially have some positive impacts. And it is the case that Andean countries have and continue to have some legal markets for coca. Bolivia has a large legal market. In Peru and Colombia, they're quite small, but they exist. And so the problem really isn't the coca. The problem is that the coca leaf in 1859, through many experiments in labs and funded by pharmaceuticals, can be used to make cocaine, which is a much more potent and potentially toxic drug. Of course, initially, cocaine is legal, as the chapter describes, and it has some medicinal uses, mainly as an anesthetic for things like surgery, but it's also toxic, and so alternatives are quickly sought and found. But then also legal coca leaf, unprocessed coca leaf, is used for making many soft drinks that folks really enjoyed, like Coca-Cola. And these were very popular for a time. And there was no association between either coca or cocaine use and violence or crime. And that's important because it makes us think more about why cocaine use is ultimately associated with both. But then we move into a period of prohibition, starting in the 1920s with this rising anti-cocaine sentiment, some of it making a lot of sense because it's coming from the medical community, but other sources of anti-cocaine sentiment coming from moralists and nativist groups in places like the United States have sort of more racist overtones and don't really have very well-supported arguments. But the medical community is also saying perhaps this isn't the best commodity for sort of medical use, and they have alternatives at the time. And this shifts through the 20th century into this very strong sort of law enforcement punitive approach. I talk a lot about the US and US society in the chapter, but the reality is that this sort of anti-cocaine sentiment and then turn to law enforcement remedies is much more widespread. And there's a similar timeline, for example, I know in Brazil and Mexico. So it's not just in the US, but the US is a powerful country. And so it plays an important role in the global shift towards more punitive law enforcement approaches. And that brings us to the 80s through to the 2020s. Where we are, in fact, in this sort of global war against drugs, mainly led by this securitization narrative that sees the cocaine trade and other kinds of illicit drug trades as threats to national security, frames them in that way. And this justifies a lot of military spending and technical support as the primary means for combating the production and trafficking of cocaine, not just in the Andes, but globally. So I think it's important to think about then what has Andean participation in this trade look like. And so what I try to do in the chapter is lay out this very complex supply chain. The chapter goes into a lot of detail, so you'll have to read it to sort of get at more of the nuances. But basically, I see 4 steps in this chain, moving from the production of raw coca, which is very historically rooted, fairly easy to do in terms of skill and capital, and provides for a sort of a livelihood that many Andean peasants wouldn't otherwise have access to, which is not to suggest any of them are getting rich off of this kind of economic activity, but they'll do better than they would with a lot of legal agricultural goods. So it does begin in Peru and Bolivia because there you have the indigenous communities that have historically produced it, but it later moves into Colombia mainly as a response to law enforcement. And so a major thread throughout this chapter that I really want to emphasize here is the impacts of law enforcement on the Andean cocaine supply chain have mainly been to cause it to become more spread out, less hierarchical, be more fragmented, but also more adaptive and more sophisticated to include more people, more countries, to become less easy to detect, for example, to become to seek out techniques for making the production of cocaine from a raw coca leaf much more advanced. And so there's important lessons there, I think, for policy in terms of moving forward with this topic and how governments and how the United Nations and other important actors should be responding. So we move from raw coca to what we call pasta básica, or like basic paste. Those are peasant cottage industries. But beyond that, when you get to making cocaine proper and then the international trafficking of cocaine, this is where more powerful, more organized criminal organizations have much control, and that's because this requires very sophisticated networks, technical skills, and a lot of capital that peasant households are not going to have. And so these are very different actors, much higher up the commodity chain. They're driving much larger profits. So it's worth mentioning that this sort of historical pattern of having sort of very well organized and wealthy sort of drug capital, so to speak, has given way to a more fragmented kind of trafficking, where many of the folks participating in this are sort of, for lack of a better way of describing them, everyday people, right? They might drop their kids off at school in the morning and then go and do a job like this. So they kind of go under the radar much more easily than, say, a Pablo Escobar, right? And this has made it much more difficult for law enforcement to combat the drug trade in the way that they have historically. And so again, there's a lot of room in this chapter for thinking about policy change. And so I conclude the chapter with a section that I think is the most important section of the chapter, which is thinking about where we are today in the 21st century in 2025. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we're living through a boom, an unprecedented boom, really, in cocaine production. And importantly, while my chapter looks at the Andes, an important characteristic of this boom is that it really reveals that the cocaine trade has expanded far beyond this region. And there are good reasons to believe that we will see these kinds of activities that have historically concentrated in just 3 countries expanding to neighboring countries like Ecuador, for example, potentially, where they haven't really been rooted before, and even parts of Central America. And of course, as the other chapters cover, this also means that other countries are becoming increasingly implicated in the trafficking networks, in the sort of the resulting violence and law enforcement efforts, has all just become flatter, more expansive, and more integrated into more societies with very negative consequences. One of the reasons for this, I think, is that the demand for cocaine has changed. There still is high demand in the US, but it really has expanded more in Europe and areas of the global South. Places like Brazil, for example, parts of Africa and Asia. And this has changed the way that cocaine gets trafficked through the Andes and through South America in general to implicate more countries and more communities. And production is much more decentralized, and the roles of Bolivia and Peru, which for a long time were secondary to Colombia, have been somewhat elevated, though Colombia remains very important. Trafficking innovations have been created mainly by the competitiveness of markets. Colombia is a good example. It has a very competitive structure to its cocaine market, and this has driven really impressive innovations, right, from the perspective of capitalism. But those innovations mean that they can yield a lot more cocaine from less coca leaf, and that's been a major factor in increased production in recent years. As well, I would say criminal organizations respond to law enforcement by improving evasion tactics. They are very adaptive. They're very sophisticated. We know they've moved beyond sort of moving drugs by boats and planes to now even commanding some submarines and things like that. And the fact that it's moving more to Europe is really the reason for a more southward flow. So we still have a northward flow, but a southward flow. And that has implications for countries along the southern route and into Europe. And yet, despite, as I mentioned in the beginning, and I'll end with this, the many, many decades of efforts to combat this trade, its production, its trafficking, its consumption, it remains high, it remains steady, and it remains expanding. And so I think that therefore, the conclusion needs to be that we, as governments, but also as societies, need to be thinking more compassionately, thoughtfully, and creatively about a better way to respond. And so I'll end with that, and I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for the presentation. Thank you both, Ivelaw and Susan, for your great presentations. Now we will hand it over to Alberto, who is the first non-American chapter in the book. So thank you, Alberto. Alberto will talk about the situation in Europe. This is one of the chapters that we have beyond Latin America and the Americas in general. So thank you so much, Alberto. The floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, Sebastian. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great.
No, yeah, they stopped.
Okay.
Now, yes.
What about now?
Yeah.
Great. So first of all, congratulations on the actual edited book. Is actually great work, and I agree with the other authors. It's a perfect timing for this kind of publication. The world of drug and cocaine, especially, is changing so much. So I think it was really needed as a contribution to the public debate and the teaching of this kind of topic. I'm sure it will be a success. So as said, my focus has been on Europe, and it has been a very exciting work to conduct. Somehow I was surprised to see the need for this kind of contribution on Europe. Okay, to have a chapter, an explanation that embraces Europe at large. And when we talk about Europe, one thing that we obviously need to consider is that indeed we are talking about a very heterogeneous mosaic of countries and situations in terms of consumption, but also in terms of modality of drug trafficking and impact on society. And so in this respect, it's really relevant to have an overall overview, but at the same time, and that's something I try to do, it's important to actually take into consideration the differences within the region in itself. In doing that, I think the work and the analysis of the current European situation very much fit within what Sebastian was describing about the overall idea of the book, of the analysis of the supply chain. Europe is basically often considered to be at the end of the supply chain, and is a region in which we have a lot of enforcement. There is a strong control of the territory, there are strong institutions, and this means that the risk for taking part in cocaine trafficking and illegal activities is high. The consequence being that the value of the cocaine within the market, within Europe, is actually high. So it's a really important node in terms of final consumption and dimension of the market due to the high risk in the region. But this is something that has been known for a very long time, especially with respect to Western and Central Europe. What's something that might be overlooked through time, and then Sebastian actually mentioned it in his introduction, is that many European countries are actually nowadays also important transit countries, important hub for the trafficking of cocaine within the region. When I think, for example, to the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, that are fundamental entry points for the trafficking of cocaine within Europe. But Europe, when we look at the data, we look at the seizures, we look also at geographic studies, we do see that now it works also as a transit point toward other parts of the world, okay? In the flow that my colleagues were describing from Latin America to Europe, and from there, cocaine flows again to the Middle East and Australia. And this perspective is actually is changing. I mean, and we need to better understand this new role of the European countries and the European ports, especially in this global traffic. So in this respect, I think the chapter contributed in depicting these new modalities of cocaine trafficking in Europe and this evolving role of Europe. At the same time, one thing that was fun to do, and I think it's potentially fun and interesting to read, is about the evolution of the role of criminal groups and people and groups involved in the trafficking in Europe. And also this was mentioned by Sebastián at the global level, but it's certainly true in the European region. Especially in the past, but unfortunately still nowadays in the policy debate, in the public debate, through the media, we often hear or the discussion point toward the capacity of cartels or large groups to the monopoly of certain markets or certain activities. What I'm mentioning in the chapters is about, for example, the role of Andrangheta in the trafficking of cocaine to Europe, and especially obviously in Italy. And these kind of groups are often depicted as being able to control the market, to fix the prices, to manage each step of the trafficking activities. On the very contrary, the environment is very much fragmented in Europe when we consider the region as a whole, but also within specific markets, specific countries. We do not observe any capacity of any of these large groups to set any monopolistic dynamics, with the exception of very tiny local markets. Okay, so within a specific neighborhood, within a specific city, perhaps we might have some monopolistic structure, but as a whole, this is really, really not the case. And this connects to the fact that we can observe that through the years, we have had a very dramatic and sharp decrease in the price, the purity adjusted price of cocaine in Europe. As the previous presenter were mentioning, the production is increasing, the flow toward Europe is increasing, and we do see that, okay? There is we observe a very important reduction in the purity adjusted price of cocaine in the region. And this obviously points both or signal both the fact that we have this increase in the flows toward the continent, but also the fact that no groups is actually able to fix the prices and to avoid the fact that the actual prices of the substance is decreasing. One other important thing that I touch within the chapter is the fact that although the market is changing, although the market is growing, systemic violence in Europe is absolutely not as prolific, is not as widespread as it is in other parts of the world. For sure, not the ones that have been presented today. This does mean that we do not have systemic violence related to cocaine trafficking in Europe. No, there is systemic violence, there is lethal violence related to cocaine trafficking in Europe, but it's very much concentrated in specific environments, specific geopolitical areas. in specific parts of the transaction at the global of the supply chain within the region. And surprisingly, this is one of the area of research on cocaine trafficking in which actually we do have an important block of empirical study, theoretical studies and analysis focusing on the European market. So there is a lot of room for research on this specific point. And to conclude, one thing that I do like about the chapter, and I think might be of interest also for researchers and people interested in looking for specific topics that might be investigated in the with respect to this market, is the fact that between the lines I signal some of the topics that I think should be investigated more within with respect to the cocaine trafficking in Europe. And the first one, as said, is definitely the violence mechanism. Okay, so again, the relation between the competition within the market, the use of violence, and the discrepancies within countries and between countries in the systemic violence within the country, the region. The second second line of topics that I think leaves rooms for further research is the organizational form. So to what extent groups are connected between each other within the region, how different forms of groups, so mafia type groups and more loose networks of traffickers do actually interact between each other. What's the type of dynamics that we observe in Europe? There is, on this, I definitely agree with Sebastian in saying that it's definitely very heterogeneous. We do observe a plethora of different type of groups, but will be definitely relevant to better understand how they interact between each other in the different contexts. And the final point, in conducting the review of the literature to build this chapter, what's come out is that the eastern part of the continent, both what is Eastern Europe within the EU and outside of EU, has not been object of study as much as Central and Western Europe. Definitely there is an issue or a question related to the language in which we publish. I mean, within Europe, obviously we do have many different languages, and it's not always easy to investigate and do this kind of research in taking into consideration these kind of languages. But for sure, there is an interest in better understanding what's going on in Eastern Europe and how also this sub-region is changing in response to this evolution of the market that we are seeing in the last years. So with this, I conclude and I leave a little bit of time for debate. Again, thanks a million for the invitation to be part of this project. Has been really a pleasure, and I really admire of the final results of the edited book. Is just a great contribution to the literature.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We really appreciate it. I'm just going to make a couple concluding remarks very briefly, and then I'll turn it over if any of our presenters have any final thoughts, or Sebastián. One of the things in the conclusions, wrapping this up is we try to look at some, and I think some of our presenters touch on this, what have been some of the unintended consequences of policies, right? Of war on drugs, of kind of mano dura or iron fist strategies in Latin America, from the cocaine cowboy periods in the 80s in Miami, as Dr. Griffith, who was a dean at FIU for many years and a former university president, studied this, knows this intimately, right? Like, how have some things changed and some things stayed the same, right? And so when you look at this, kind of the 101 of drug trafficking often is this balloon effect, right? And so how have drugs moved? How have they shifted? And that's something when we look at the literature and looking at a lot of these classic works by people like Francisco Toomey and Paul Gutenberg, and Susan does a terrific job of this as well, is seeing what's changed and what stayed the same, right? I think one of the other things too, in addition to the balloon effect, is this kind of, particularly in the U.S. war on drugs, and I focus on Latin America, right, is the unintended consequences of this fragmentation of organized crime, right? That you have hundreds of criminal actors operating, not just major transnational organized crime groups. We have subcontractors. You have, transportation groups like Los Cachitos in Honduras, right? And among other actors. And then, how do these groups work together and play a role? Michael Paulberg, and just as we're hoping to do multiple presentations because we have so many great authors, but he wrote a really interesting kind of case study of Central America and what I often call the myths versus the realities, right? Sometimes I think there's this myth that Mara Salvatrucha or the 18th Street Gang is controlling cocaine trafficking coming from Colombia all the way to New Zealand or Australia, right? And that's not true, right? And so, are they involved in micro trafficking? Yes. Are they involved in extortion? Yes. But are they a major drug cartel? And so he kind of looks at, the myths versus the reality in the Central American dynamic, including these major actors in the Northern Triangle that operate as transportation groups and are subcontracted by larger groups. The last point that I would say, and I, focusing mainly on my kind of area of study is Latin America, is looking at this notion of governance, right? Of kind of bringing the state back in, looking at institutions, looking at impunity, looking at corruption. In some cases, this kind of symbiotic relationship between the state and organized crime. And scholars and working on this issue of criminal governance in certain zones. And what is the role of institutions? What's the role of states? And how can we understand? In certain things, I sometimes joke, and I won't mention too many cases, but some of this stuff you can make up, right? Some of this stuff reads as though, when you have presidents involved in the drug trade and chiefs of police, it reads as though it was, a poorly written crime novel, right? But at the end of the day, kind of bringing the state back in and looking at this relationship. And we've seen a litany of reforms, institutions, but how can we understand that dynamic as well, right? So I think this is a really, a humble brag, right? But a really important contribution of kind of bringing up to date some of these classic works and looking at this comprehensive approach. And what we're hoping to do too, we have this comparative approach of realizing there's so many similarities, but there are also major differences, right? Between countries, between regions, between contexts, and looking at these connections. And Alberto, I think, does this terrific job when we're looking at the connections as well. We have looking at from South America and Brazil and the cocaine trade to West Africa onto Europe and seeing these dynamics. So I'll conclude there. Let me turn it back over. If Sebastián has any comments, and I invite as well Susan, Alberto, and Ivelaw, if you have any final comments or conclusions. This is being a broadcast live, and I'm sure more people will have questions, and we'll share our streaming. But we're really proud of just this really diverse, amazing group of authors from around the globe, right? Which is it's been a pleasure to work with them. So let me turn over to if our presenters have any final comments, analysis, or in our last few minutes, or Sebastián, but I'll end my comments there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Well, if I don't know if the contributors have any comment. If not, I think that we're finishing. Yes, Ivelaw. Yes, let's go to you, please.
If you'll allow me to make a quick comment on something that Susan said and something that Alberto said and something that Jonathan. Susan was talking about the positive aspects of the coca leaf. It took me back to my first visit to La Paz, Bolivia. And the harsh reality of the altitude of La Paz, almost 12,000 feet above sea level. Had I not had coca tea, I could not survive those 4 days in La Paz. And so part of the geographic reality linked to the cultural realities helped to explain the utility of the coca leaf for decades in parts of the Americas. When Alberto was speaking about Europe, and I think Susan had a slide where there was a container. Took me back to May of this year. There was a massive 4-day conference in Hamburg looking at cocaine trafficking upsurge to Europe. And it ended with, we had a wonderful tour of the Hamburg port, third largest port in Europe. You couldn't believe, when Jonathan said some of the stuff you could make up, some of the stuff I couldn't believe, was happening in Europe. The dynamics, the ingenuity of the traffickers, the ingenuity of the people who are on the illegal side of operating in societies. But I want to end with one comment, and Jonathan mentioned things you wouldn't believe. I had a huge grant in the early 90s from the MacArthur Foundation, which led to my one of the things that book I did in 1997, Drugs and Security in the Caribbean. And I had an experience in researching that project that led me decades later to write a novel, which came out last year. I couldn't believe I was experiencing what I experienced in a tiny part of the Caribbean, where a woman was trying to sell me cocaine. I said no, and she started to explain to me how I can use it for sex. I would not have believed. So I remember when I did the book and I mentioned something with that, one of the reviewers says Professor Griffith needs to put a footnote saying he's not advocating the use of cocaine for sex. But it was such an outlandish, unbelievable experience. I said, when I retire, I'm going to write a novel, which I did publish last year.
Thank you, Ivelaw. I don't know if Susan or Alberto had any final comment. No. Oh,
Yeah.
good, Susan. Yeah.
Just something really quick to follow up on what Jonathan said about bringing the state back in and thinking about what has and hasn't changed. And I think one thing that hasn't changed enough, though I wouldn't say it hasn't changed at all, is just the general response of states and the international community to drug trafficking, using policies that are clearly a failure. And I think to add to that, it's worth mentioning that there have been opportunities for governments to respond in different ways. A few years ago, there was a bust in coca prices in Colombia due to overproduction coming out of the pandemic. And that created a crisis for the people who produce coca. It created a crisis of an economic kind. And there was just an opportunity in my mind for the state to then move in and be responsive to that crisis in a humanitarian kind of way. And that could have been a way to reach these communities, but we didn't see that play out. And so I do think we need to think more about what states could do instead, and also how even while the market is so adaptive and responsive to what states do, states are not being adaptive or responsive to what the market is doing. And this is deeply problematic, I think. And so I just wanted to add that to Jonathan's comments.
Thank you. Alberto, any final comments?
Yeah, sure. Me too. And the state control and the reaction of the market, I think, for Europe especially, but for other parts of the world, the balloon effect or the displacement of the routes, the modalities, is something that is really manifesting a lot. And this push us as researchers, but then government as well, to take this into consideration, to reason in response to this, thinking that whatever the intervention, there is the possibility then to displace, to change the strategy. And this need to be taken into account in the design of the policy, but also will require the state, or should push the states also to monitor this phenomena in more precise manner, to actually be able to evaluate the impact of the policy. Even staying within a tradition or prohibitionism regime, you want to make sure to at least have an understanding on what's the impact in terms of routes, modalities, actors, and definitely is often not the case, at least in Europe.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much again, Ivelaw, Susan, Alberto, for the presentations. Thanks to Jonathan, the co-author and the co-editor of the book, and thank you so much also to the University of New Mexico Press. We're looking forward to have probably a second round of presentations soon. Hopefully that will happen in January or February. So please keep tuned, and we will